Well, to start with everyone, I'm so honored to be here. I'm seeing so many familiar faces and seeing so many people that I am privileged enough to present a short lecture about both the discipline of African cinema and Ousmane Sembène, who continues to inform and influence my practice as a curator, as a researcher, and widely as a culture worker immensely. We're about to watch Bodum Sade, meaning Cart Driver in Wolof, and La Noire de, Black Girl. Both are some of the filmmakers' much earlier works, and in a larger sense, they encapsulate the radical pursuits of cultural workers such as Sembene, as well as how and why African cinema was and still is a crucial social political framework to comprehend not just ongoing historical ruptures and continuums in the forms of mass protests going on in the African continent at the moment, as I speak, but also the past and ongoing African migration histories, notions of citizenship that extend far beyond Africa's borders and into Denmark, where we find ourselves present, but also the wider Nordic region. To begin with, I have to clarify and say that understanding African cinema is truly a journey in the largest sense, really. And what I intend to present today and is just a fraction of a quite expansive and vast discipline, but hopefully what I am able to say within the frame of just 30 minutes will lay some really good groundwork for the Danish Film Institute first ever retrospective of the filmmaker's work. And when you attend some of the other screenings, hopefully, that you are also able to think from a framework of why these films are still so incredibly crucial and relevant to understand politics of today and the context of anti-Blackness as well, to draw on from the recent summer. African cinema has its advent with the expansion of colonialism throughout the African continent. Filmmaking, or rather the camera itself, and the other several forms that the camera took were integral to the colonial project by furthering a visual spectralization that was fundamental to a structural framework of colonialism and dehumanization that justified the project itself. Every European colonial powers had a state-supported film unit that were responsible for documenting, sharing images, and creating educational cinematic material that was sent back to colonial centers throughout the Western world to educate about colonial subjects. That is to say that the camera, as I call it, is a white supremacist cinematic structure, was a tool of empire, and its residues of optical colonial consciousness till this day lingers. This is particularly prevalent in how we see development photography, but that's an entirely different story I'll not go into today. Thus, African cinema in its early formation was an institution of white European colonialism. It was understood very early on that the moving image could colonize, and as it could have a colonizing effect, it could also have a subversive effect, which is integral to decolonization and the social change that was fundamental to decolonization's pursuit. European colonialists understood this very quickly, enforcing very strict censorship laws and boards, some with the function to prevent what films African could see throughout the colonies, and others to enforce decrees that controlled what film could be made and in fact who could make films. Throughout French colonies, in the context of Ousmane Sembène here today, this was fully officiated with a law called the Laval Decree, founded in 1934. The decree required all forms of filmmaking in French colony throughout Africa, Asia, and the French-speaking Caribbean to be authorized by colonial boards. Its function was, of course, to control, moreover prevent, here in the context of Africa, Africans from filmmaking and production. This lasted well until the 1950s, and in some cases, actually the early 1960s, where independence throughout brought the end of this law. I.e., one of the first films made by an African filmmaker was Afrique Sucine by filmmakers Jacques Melokane, Mamadou Sarr, and Pauline Soumanou Vieira, which was actually filmed in Paris because the Laval Decree prohibited filming in Senegal as intended. Vieira, who was a pioneering filmmaker and is actually really considered as the father of African filmmaking, but I don't like this term because it's very paternalistic and quite patriarchal in its framing of African cinema, But he was a filmmaker and historian who was also Sembène's mentor, in fact. And Vieira was a key member of the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, shortened as FEPACI, who would not only found the biennial Pan-African Film Festival FESPACO in Burkina Faso, but also run filmmaking courses, mentoring upcoming filmmakers and establishing cinema industries in their own countries despite very limited funding. That is to say here that the context and the fight for African independence was also an inherent fight for cinema. Not just its making, not just its distribution, not just the counteracting of colonialism's very violent representation of Africans, but also the importance of building and employing filmic registers to establish revolutionary and liberatory dialogues between filmmakers, audiences, and in extension, building an international Marxist solidarity across geographical borders and across racial cultures as well. The early post-independent formation of African filmmakers and their authorial style centered a profound understanding of not just filmmaking, but culture as a crucial to decolonization of the mind and of thinking as well. Cinema, as I say, was as much an artistic choice as it was political, and this is so important to understand when we talk about African cinema. Ousmane Sembène, a Senegalese novelist and filmmaker, emerges in the context here as one of the most important filmmakers of African cinema, not just because Sembène's artistic oeuvre worked within a framework of culture as a vehicle of liberation, but because he was also able to consolidate his political praxis with a national and international distribution of his films. Therein lies a major landmark. This isn't to say that the generation before Sembène had not done this before, but Sembène had the possibility of doing this because he had established himself as a literary writer before he became a filmmaker. So there was a groundwork and a framework for him to work on already that allowed an easier transaction. Sembène was born in 1923 into a poor working class family in the southern Casamanca region of Senegal. He left school quite early, actually, working various odd jobs and teaching himself to write and speak French. He is a self-educated filmmaker, I should clarify. He's not gone to school in that sense. He turned to filmmaking at a rather late age compared to some of his other contemporaries, as he, according to his own accord, had worked some around 30-odd different jobs before that. He was a mason, a soldier in the French colonial army during World War II, and later shoreman at the docks of Marseille, where he settled some years later after service. There he became an active union organizer amongst working-class African migrant workers. The identifications of this experience were profound in his artistic career, and the recurring themes of Marxist readings of migration, class, race, neocolonialism, and anti-capitalist critique that were all central to his work. His first novel, The Black Dock Worker, published in 1956, drew upon this experience of living in Marseille and living life on the periphery as a non-citizen, really. His second, O Country, My Beautiful People, from 1957, was about a man from Casamanca who wanted to create an independent business in his native Senegal, but faced immense adversaries from colonial merchants and caste prejudice amongst his own peasant society. Finally, his third novel, God's Bit of Wood from 1960, is one of his better recognizable novels, in which Senegalese and Malian laborers between 1947 and 1948 collectively strike on the Dakar and Bamako Railroad. This particular book cements Sembène as a leading post-independent writer before he becomes a filmmaker, and not just as a leading writer, but as a leading Marxist writer that was heavily affiliated to the global nationalist liberation movement around the world, where he lived briefly in Cuba, China, and the Soviet Union as well. In some ways, Sembène here is already astutely aware of his versatility, then takes on the form of short stories instead. And he published a longer collection called Voltaïque in 1962, in which the subsequent novels and films for Mandabi, that's part of this program, as well as Black Girl and another one called Nyai, find their roots. Upon Senegal's independence in 1960, 97% of Senegalese people did not speak French, yet Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was the first president of the country and one of Negritude's co-founders, decided to officiate French as the national language of the country. This was not just the case of Senegal, but widely throughout all kinds of French colonies and even English-speaking colonies as well. Here in that time, filmmakers, African filmmakers, particularly those that were of the Maxis school, understood very early that language, culture, and understanding of language and framework poses a tension and in some way also insulates some of these ongoing neo-colonial vestiges throughout the countries. So filmmaking becomes an incredibly radical and significant tool in how one is able to rethink freedom in a post-independent period. Oh, sorry, guys. Shortly after the publication of Voltaïque, Sembène settles in the Soviet Union for a year, studying film under the quite famous Soviet director Mark Donskoy, alongside close friend and equally prolific filmmaker, the late Sarah Maldaroa, who I highly recommend that you also follow her work. There's one called Zambizanga that's on YouTube. In a 1963 interview with film historian Julien Nebel, Sembène concludes that filmmaking offered a greater opportunity than the written literary form to crystallize what he called a consciousness among the masses. This is particularly true, as you will see when you see these films and perhaps something else of the program as well. Seeing Sembène's work, there is a sense or a feeling of imposition, no sense or feeling of imposition, rather, that provides a set of fixed solutions to problems that are to problems that are present. I mean, yeah, sure, exploitation, class disparities, and other neo-colonial vestiges are centered instead, recentered to provide knowledge, or rather awareness, about the ways in which gaps between the rich, who institute laws, bureaucratic institutions, and the poor who suffer these inequities, are continuums of a wider political problem that underpins somewhat the failures of independence in not just Senegal, but throughout the wider African world or throughout the wider Black world. As Sembène said, I'm not trying to make cinema for my buddies or limit to circle specialists. What I'm interested in is exposing problems of the people to which I belong. For me, cinema is a political action. Naturally, in Sembène's work, there is a dialectic relationship between social critique, ideological considerations, and educational, more of a political purpose. There is a refusal to present an uncritical glorification of the past, as we've seen with some other people, as there is a refusal to present a glorified present when he believes, and other filmmakers believe, that it exists and continues to exist under a false guise of change which has never really materialized. But instead, there is an astute commitment to complicate, problematize what representation really is, and heighten awareness of acceptance that can very easily appear as almost untouchable. Sembène's work are never really manifestos that you'll see, but they're rich, multi-layered, and contrasting centers concerned with how power relations, social and economic inequalities continue to both haunt and pervade life for many people. This dialectic relationship between politics and society situated Sembène and several other of his contemporary authors, such as Malin Suleiman Cissé, Philippe Moury from Gabon, Sarah Maldaroa, Ahmed Bounani from Morocco, Met Hundre from Mauritania, Djibril Diop Mambéty from Senegal, Idrissa Ouedraogo from Burkina Faso, and many others outside of the nation state. And it situated them outside of the nation state because their work questioned the very existence of the legitimacy of it. This means that they were generally very pro-socialist in their approach to filmmaking and what it offered to their audiences, and very capitalist. So African cinema, as its root and core to it, is a posing or a contestation rather that questions the legitimacy of political leadership. It asks really, who do we implicate within what we call independence, and who is it that is part of sustaining a framework that exploits people that are poor? Consequently, state censorship wasn't that uncommon. For Ousmane Sembène, his earlier films Sedo and Hala were actually censored. Hala had 10 scenes cut out from the original score that was actually made, and Sedo was entirely banned under Léopold Sédar Senghor's presidency. And this is interesting because Léopold Senghor is hailed as the more liberal of African presidents in the post-independent period. And very funny enough, there was always somewhat of a strange tension between him and Ousmane Sembène, as Senghor liked to position himself as the liberal one for allowing Sembène to produce his critique under a free Senegal, yet also imposing quite largely restrictions on what films could be made through various legal bureaucracies that existed to prevent any forms of state critique. So yeah, very little state support was granted to independent filmmaking, and the form of independent filmmaking that existed at that time was very much foregrounded in supporting the legitimacy of states, really. And states did very little to also reform any of these existing structures to support filmmaking. So even as African independence and cinema pose as a crucial tool to independence and redoing of societies, distribution of filmmaking very much still lied in the hands of white Western or European distributors. So the French, the American, and sometimes Lebanese companies were the ones that were still controlling distribution of African films, even in the early 60s to 70s period. So it wasn't actually until the 1980s that small efforts to nationalize distribution industries were made, and Algeria was particularly leading on that front. Ousmane Sembène spoke very greatly of these difficulties in sustaining the reach of his work when financial and commercial restraints blocked the growth of what was an incredibly important discipline and put filmmakers like himself into a web of relying on external funding. This was contradictory, of course, but between that and the positions that also try to quantify freedom, you do also have to make quite contradictory choices at time, and he's been very, very honest about that. We're going to see these two films today, and I hope that when you see it, you're able to perhaps think and reflect more deeply on what positions of work they offer in not quantifying freedom as a constitutional illusionary, but dreaming of it as a collective, expansive elasticity, as a collective praxis. One thing that I think filmmakers, and I urge you not to repeat when you see the films today, is to say that they're beautiful. That's a word I absolutely loathe hearing people say. And this goes really back to a development or a time of when African filmmakers were coming out to the market and encountering European film critics who would often say, oh, you know, these films are so beautiful. They're so beautiful, as if beauty is the only thing that they can offer. And yes, it is very true. They're very, very beautiful. Just don't fucking say it. And if you are going to say it or think of it, then please rather think of something as where aesthetics, it's not just a binary between something that is visually appealing to your eye, but aesthetics is rather read as a very informed, political, and radical choice that tries to think about a framework of decoloniality and critique of resistance in subduing what has always been a very ugly visual representation of Africans and Black people. So this is what I can offer you today. African cinema and its migration discourses. We have very little both educational understandings of African cinema in the Nordic region, and I'm not just saying Denmark, but across Norway, Sweden, and Finland as well. And one of the reasons that we don't have it is because many African filmmakers have never really thought about this region. But in seeing Borum Saret today and also seeing Black Girl, but particularly Black Girl, I urge us to think about how this film with Joanna, who's the main character, who's a Black migrant worker that settles in France under the guise that she's finding a safe and comfortable home to be in. I urge us to think about how it is able to offer us a great deal of understanding some of the ongoing migration histories that we have in Denmark today of Black people, that we have within our own families and sometimes also within ourselves. The film's paradigmization of migrant labor is incredibly crucial to understand why it is that in our societies today, Black people still earn much less than our white counterparts despite being educated or as likely educated, and why it is that we all find ourselves very often on the periphery of society. And more importantly, it offers a very, very important nuance of what it means to speak about migration from a position of being a citizen and from a position of being a non-citizen. And this is imperative. So the first film that he made was actually Purum Sara, and the funding came from the book that he wrote, which was God's Bit of Wood. That's where he acquired the funding, and it was primarily self-funded as well. And from what I understand, so he was given some money by the Soviet government after graduating when he studied under Donskoy Studio in Soviet Union. And the second one that he then made, which was La Noix d'Eux, that was funded by the French Culture Ministry, I believe, or partially funded by the French Culture Ministry. So yeah, it's also, it's very, very difficult to talk about African cinema and then not also have, astute awareness of the contradictions of where the funding came from. But, it poses these filmmakers in a really quite contradictory position of, do I accept the funding to make this film, or do I then not accept the funding and then not make this film at all? And I think we can be a bit forgiving of them, because you can still have a very critical and quite a critical perspective on things and even still accept some kind of funding if it is implicated within critiquing that structure that you find yourself working against. Actually, not. This is really funny, and I do apologize for not clarifying this in the beginning. When we talk about African cinema, I'm quite guilty of sort of keeping Nollywood out sometimes. And I think that's also because Nollywood, unlike African cinema, as I understand it from, like, say, primarily former French colonies, did not have that same commercial praxis to it as Nollywood did. And also Nollywood seems to emerge first early in the late 70s and early 80s. And by that time, as actively striving as African cinemas from former French-speaking colonies were, they were also very much in the decline because of funding issues. So many of the few that were made at that time were also made in the late 80s, were actually often outside of the country or were larger budget productions and longer feature films as well. But of course, Nollywood has not always been in that good, well, I wouldn't say dialogue, but Nollywood has always developed itself somewhat as an entity of its own that is very, very rooted in Nigerian pop culture. And secondly, Nollywood can be understood in two ways, really. There's obviously the first one of filmmakers such as like Ola Balogun from the 1970s, who were making films and in dialogue very much with other African filmmakers of the West African continent. And then you have filmmakers of the later 80s that then start to make like quite commercially popular films, really. But something else I would also say is that, of course, it can be bound in like industries that can be defined in like whether it's Nollywood or Gollywood, for example, in Ghana. But it's also important to understand that there is a dialectic relation between every single film, regardless of where it is by geography. Every single African filmmaker is in dialogue with each other, and their works exist never in isolation, ever, because they're talking about the same issues.